Some Quincy residents are concerned about the Quincy Police Department's proposed license plate reader program. Tonight, the chief hosted a meeting to address those worries, and WGEM's Charity Bell was there. And Charity, you talked to those concerned residents.
Daniel, some people say they were concerned about how the pictures and data would be captured and stored, if it would invade their privacy, and if it's constitutional. Police Chief Adam Yates says the department proposes placing 20 cameras around various parts of the city. The cameras will take pictures of license plates and are not designed to take pictures of people. Yates says the photos gathered are stored for 30 days and is triggered when a license plate is ran and it shows up in their database wanted because it's stolen or was used in a crime. Some aldermen say their constituents are in favor of the program. Others say they've had people express they're not fully comfortable. And people I talked to who attended the meeting say the program is needed and the information provided tonight didn't change their minds. It answered their questions.
My only concern is the data security. We all know about data breaches that happen throughout the country and over the last few years, and just wanting to know more about how that's handled, what it's used for, and I don't think I got that out of the presentation.
And I do believe that it will reduce crime. My only concern is with the cameras becoming more widespread. I don't know if I trust Flock Safety, the actual company. They're pretty new. They were started in 2017. And once they become more widespread nationwide, who will have access to that, like the FBI or something?
Chief Yates says the city of Quincy will own the photos and that they will not be sold to other parties. One question raised tonight: if police are in control of the photos, what are the protocols in place to ensure that officers will use the information properly? Yates said it's ethics. He says it's up to police to handle the photos justly, and if the audits show officers are not, they will face severe discipline and possible termination. Live in Quincy, Charity Bell, WGEM News.
Thank you, Charity. And this will go before the City Council. But before then, there's another public presentation. It will be held this Wednesday at 6 p.m. at the Quincy Town Center.